Both for your testimony. We'll start a series of 5-minute rounds of questioning. Since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration has corralled the EU, the UK, Japan, and other allies into a sanction regime that is really unprecedented in scope. And while I give them a lot of credit, we've been leveraging sanctions on Russia for years, but it's clear that existing sanctions and export controls are not crushing the Russian economy in a way that will force it to stop waging war in Ukraine. For both of you, aside from cracking down on sanctions evasion by China, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and other countries, what other pressure can or should we bring against Russia to reinforce and expand upon the impact of existing sanctions?
Okay. Well, as you said, this is an unprecedented sanctions regime that we've put in place. And I think the theory behind the case is that the longer that the sanctions remain in place, the more effective they will become. And I do think that we've begun to see evidence that that is the case. Certainly in specific industries, the airline industry, the car industry, the impact of sanctions are slowly being felt. The sanctions on microchips and other things are slowing down Russia's defense industrial production. So over time, the sanctions hopefully will have greater effect. But there, as you indicate, there's multiple and additional steps that the United States could take to strengthen that regime. I think first and foremost is in the energy realm. And I think that Congress could advocate for lowering the price cap down from its current price of $60 per barrel. So that would be one area where Congress, I think, could advocate more vocally so that Russia continues to be squeezed, particularly in the energy domain, which continues to be a key lifeline for its ability to sustain its war abroad. So advocating to bring that price cap down is one. I think there's also additional sectors that still have yet to be sanctioned. For example, companies like Rosatom, including a ban on Russian uranium. There's still other key sectors of the Russian economy that haven't been targeted by sanctions and where additional sanctions could have a further impact on Russia's economic viability. And then I think the most important thing, which you already referenced, is really about sanctions enforcement. This continues to be a major problem. There is already evidence that Russia is working very hard to evade the sanctions that are in place. And so for Congress to be able to build the enforcement capacity, not just in the United States, but also critically in the European Union. I think a lot of our allies don't have the same enforcement capacity as we have in the United States. And so having U.S. Congress be able to fund those efforts to enhance the capacity of our allies and partners will help us tighten the screws. And there's other things that the U.S., not necessarily for Congress, could do, but creating a unified database with all sanctions entities and institutions. So I think, again, going after energy, there's more that we can do there. Targeting additional sectors that have not yet been impacted and really thinking very hard about the enforcement piece, I think, is the way forward.
Thank you. Ambassador Solomon?
Yeah, I think Dr. Kendall Taylor has really hit the key points. I would emphasize energy as well. But one thing to keep in mind, and this I base this statement on a comment that Putin himself made. He was asked by a Russian nationalist, why didn't we do the special military operation earlier? Why did you wait so long? We knew this Nazi regime existed in Kyiv. Why did we wait? And Putin said we weren't ready. It wasn't that we weren't ready militarily. It was we weren't ready to protect our economy. He's been working on this for a long time. He spent more time worrying about how he was going to protect his economy than he did, frankly, planning the military aspects of his special military operation, which have failed miserably. But I thought that was a telling answer by him. So they've been working on this for a long time. We basically started from a standing start. We had sectoral sanctions in place after Crimea, after the Donbass, sure, but nothing like we're doing now. Putin didn't expect this, but he was planning for it, and he's had time to work with his friends, his partners, his dear friend in Beijing, the new government in Brazil, the South Africans, the BRICS in particular. China, India, Brazil have really been a lifeline for him.
Which I'm glad you said that, because while we've been focused on Ukraine, the truth is that the United States and Russia are actively competing for alliances, economic and security partners all over the world. Russia has been cultivating relationships with huge countries across Africa, like notably South Africa and others in the Sahel, as well as with dictators in our own hemisphere. What tools, engagement, and outreach should we be thinking about to best posture the United States in this existential competition with Russia for partnerships across the globe?
Well, Senator Kaine and I, some months ago, had a conversation somewhat related to this, and I think I'd summarize it as 3 Ds: diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. We need to be engaged and not badgering countries to say, you need to support us on Ukraine. We need to do a better job. I had a conversation with Sir John Scarlett, the former head of MI6. We do need to do a better job of explaining the brutality of Russia's war in Ukraine. And this is a war waged, as I said in my opening statement, by a permanent member of the Security Council. For a country like Brazil, a country like India, Russia's presence in the Security Council renders that a null body for purposes of dealing with a problem like this. But it's diplomacy. The fact that the Security Council is now hamstrung means that it's more important for my former colleagues at the Department and across the U.S. government, at our embassies, to be reaching out and establishing better relationships in Pretoria and Delhi, et cetera. And I think the Biden administration is working on this.
I agree with the diplomacy piece is key, and I think the only thing I would add to that is I think a lot of the countries in the so-called global south don't want to be forced to pick sides. I think there's many countries who don't buy into this kind of democracy versus authoritarianism. They don't want to be dragged into the U.S. confrontation with China. And so working on discrete issues where the interests align is key to, I think, that effective diplomacy. The paying attention piece is really critical. I mean, as Senator Risch was saying, there are opportunities to exploit here in terms of going on the offensive and taking the fight to Russia. In regions like Central Asia, for example, many of these countries, particularly in Russia's kind of periphery, are extremely skeptical and wary of relations with Russia for the first time in a very long time. And so if we pay attention, the U.S. State Department, I believe, sent a delegation, a critically timed delegation, to also work with those countries to help the enforcement of sanctions. So diplomacy and paying attention and picking up on the vacuum that Moscow is leaving behind in many places is key. Arms sales is another key opportunity with the global south, the Middle East. Russia will have fewer arms to sell going forward as they have to choose to send arms into Ukraine or to sell them for export. Those relationships that Russia has with India, many countries in the Middle East, are relationships that Russia uses to tether those countries to Moscow. This is an opportune time for the United States to consider whether we can step in or have allies step in to break those relationships. And then, as you mentioned, I think in the opening statements, the information domain is also critical. And so continued funding for the U.S. Agency of Global Media and other efforts that help the United States to continue to engage in these media environments are all critical, I think, for competing with those countries.
Thank you. You've both hit on a key that we are trying to work through in the China bill, which is how do we beef up our diplomatic abilities across the globe. China has more embassies, more personnel across the globe than we do. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you. Let me